Hey there, guys. Hope you're having a great day. We're going to do the second day of notes for ancient China. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the kind of life, the social classes and the life, basic things that they went through, and then talk about a couple more dynasties. So the social classes are a little different than maybe what we're used to or what like medieval Europe did. So top class were the land-owning aristocrats. These are the wealthy people, the nobles, if you were, that owned the land, right? Made sense. But here's where it was different. In most systems, the peasant farmers were the low class. But in this system, they were second. They were like more like middle class, if you will. And in the bottom were the merchants. They were the considered low class people. The merchants were those who were like bankers and traders and who sold things and traded for things. But the peasant farmers were actually looked upon as more important because they fed, right, the nation or fed the kingdom with the work they did. So that was the system. The aristocrats, the high class, they owned large estates outside of the village. These large estates were basically where all the farmland was. And what eventually happens, though, is these estates, these large chunks of land they owned, began to shrink or like get smaller as every generation they would give the land to their sons and then their grandsons and the great grandsons. And the problem in China is that they started to run out of land. And so this would cause war and conflict as the armies then would have to go out and conquer more land so the rich aristocrats could have it. Okay. But they usually lived in large houses and owned the farmland. Okay. Below them, the second, like the middle class, which was about 90% of all Chinese people were farmers, were the peasant farmers. They lived in simple houses inside the village walls. They grew things like wheat, millet, and rice. These were things that grew well in China's climate and geography. And they would have a small piece of land to feed their families. So they did own a little bit of land, and they worked hard, as most farmers do. And the important thing is that they were actually seen as a higher class than the merchants because of the work they did. Okay. And the duties of the farmers were pretty simple. First of all, they had to pay taxes, which they typically paid in crops, just like the people in medieval Europe did. They did have to work 1 month of the year for the government in some sort of government job. Not always for pay, but this was kind of part of what was required of them. And in return, they were, of course, given protection, if you will, by the government. And then they also had to fight in the army when needed. And so when the army, the government needed more soldiers, it was the farmer's job to fight. Okay. The merchants, who were actually the low class, they were the shopkeepers, the traders, the bankers. They were seen as low class, even though some were very wealthy. They weren't allowed to work and get government jobs. And so the philosophy was that you're supposed to do whatever you can for the good of the people, the good of the community, the good of the country. And they were looked upon as merchants were trying to get rich and, for themselves, to make money for themselves, and they didn't do much to benefit the country. And that's why they were looked down upon. Big part of family life was this idea of filial piety, which just was a very harsh rule that said the children had to respect their parents and older relatives, which I think, is true in a lot of cultures. But this was just really, really strict, that all respect was owed to your parents and older relatives, with harsh penalties and discipline if you didn't. The head of a household in this culture was the male. So the oldest male of the family was the one who made all the decisions. He's the one who owned the property. He's the one who basically made the decisions for the family. Men, as in most ancient civilizations, were more respected. They're the ones who went to school and learned how to read and write, where the women didn't. They were the ones who were in charge of the government and held office. Women did not. And they're the ones, of course, who then fought in the wars. Women, on the other hand, which were pretty typical of ancient cultures, the job was to raise the children. They managed the household. They were not allowed to own government posts, and they were definitely less respected. Couldn't own property. They just had less rights and freedoms, if you would, than the men did. Okay. All right, let's learn about a couple more dynasties. So we had talked about the Shang and the Zhou dynasty. These were the beginning early dynasties. But the Qin dynasty comes and is really the first dynasty that is going to unify all of China. So under the emperor, who's known as the first Qin emperor, his name is Qin Shi Huangdi. He's the one who unites all these separate kingdoms that are fighting against each other and all kind of get their own power. And he gets together and he brings a strong army and he just brings them all under his rule. He's very strict. He's based his philosophy, his rule on this philosophy called legalism, which says those who opposed him were punished or killed. He didn't think that people in charge should earn that because of how smart they were. They should be people that are loyal to him. Anyone who wrote books against him, they were burned. The books were burned. Anyone who spoke out against him were imprisoned or even put to death. He was strict. That's what legalism was all about. Okay, punish those who don't follow the rules. He does unify China. He fills the official government posts with strong rulers that are very loyal to him. And he creates one currency. In other words, one type of money that all of China can use instead of separate money for every kingdom. He gets on a building spree of things. He builds roads to unify and connect the country. He builds the world's largest canal, known as the Grand Canal. Canal is a man-made river where they had to dig out, right, basically the land to have water flow. That way they could transport, use ships that are faster than people walking. This took tens of thousands of slaves to build. It took many, many years. He also strengthened the Great Wall. The Great Wall had already been started by other dynasties, but the Qin dynasty really begins to build it in a strong way. Just so you know, too, the Great Wall of China, what you see today, is not the same wall that you would have that was built by the Qin dynasty. Today, it's much more thicker and bigger, but he does increase the size of it. He has a lot of it built. This was basically to protect them from their enemies in the north. All right, real quick here, guys. Another dynasty after the Qin dynasty comes the Han dynasty, started by Liu Bong, and he throws out all those harsh policies of the Qin dynasty, and he gets rid of legalism and such a harsh punishment to the people. He wanted talented people to fill the government post. So they had to take these long, really difficult tests to get jobs in the bureaucracy. If you're going to work for the government, you had to prove that you were smart enough. These tests were called the civil service exams. They lasted for about 2,000 years, and it favored the rich. In other words, only really the rich could afford to educate their sons and get them ready for this really, really hard test, which I think you took somewhere around 10 or 11 or somewhere around your age. And if you did well on the test, you could work in the government. And if you couldn't, your opportunities were very low. So imagine if the test that you take like this year, those tests like the MAP test, imagine if that decided whether you were allowed to have good jobs or not good jobs. That was the pressure put on these kids. They started preparing for this test around age 7. They weren't allowed to do any sports. They weren't allowed to do anything that was really about fun. It was all about study every day, every single day, and even into the night just to take this test. And really only 1 in 5 typically passed the test, which is pretty amazing. That's not very many. If you didn't pass it, it's kind of interesting. You became a teacher, right? So that's kind of sad, but the teachers then would teach. They didn't pass the test, but they'd be the ones that try to teach other people to pass it. Kind of funny. But also, if you didn't teach it, you became a servant or an assistant to the government officials. They had the good job. You were just serving them, or you just supported by your family and you stayed at home. This test was a huge, big piece of pressure on young people. And even in modern days, there's been some places in China that still have a test like that your whole future based on that at a very young age. And so that was all set up by the Han dynasty, which came after the Qin dynasty. Please know that the Qin dynasty was the dynasty that unified China, and it was really known as the first unified dynasty, if you will. Okay, he was known as the first emperor. That was Qin Shi Huangdi. So I hope you got a lot from that, and keep this in your binder, in your notes, in your folder, and view a quiz next week. See you guys.